and I was given a nutrition course to teach, and it was like falling in love. I just loved the way that nutrition related to history, science, social values, health, policy, any kind of studies that you could think of. I just loved the way that if you studied about food or if you studied about nutrition, you could get involved in all of these other things that really interested me. And I taught my first course in nutrition in the fall of 1975. I taught about the Daily Food Guide, of course, but I also used as texts in that class, Diet for a Small Planet, which had just come out and recently came out in a 50th anniversary edition. A book from Center for Science in the Public Interest, an advocacy group in Washington called Food for People, Not for Profit, that could have been written yesterday because the articles in it discuss the issues that are still very current. And then there was a faculty member at Brandeis named Jeffrey Barclay, a historian, who had written a couple of lengthy articles for the New York Review of Books on wealth and power, the politics of food and oil. And I used those articles as texts in the class too. So the politics of food was in there right from the beginning. I couldn't see how you could talk about dietary guidelines or advice about diet without talking about the politics of it. And I was kind of off and running. As I said, I had remarried by that time. And I went to, we moved to San Francisco, to the University of California, San Francisco. And I went there with a very fancy title, Associate Dean for Human Biology Programs in the School of Medicine. But this was very much a situation in which I was a trailing spouse. And believe me, I knew everything that was talked about in a book about the travails of a trailing spouse. Been there, done that. But I did get to do some interesting things while I was there. One of them was I was on a television program for old people called Over Easy that ran out of KQED in San Francisco. And over a 2 or 3 year period, I did segments on nutrition on that program with the host, Frank Blair, and also with Craig Claiborne. So there was a situation where I was in the food area. There I am talking about the molecular structure of sugar. Amazing when I look back on it. I also wrote a book called Nutrition in Clinical Practice, which is a book for medical students. And a couple of years ago, when I was putting a talk like this together, I went on to Amazon to see whether copies of that book were available anywhere. I was absolutely astounded to find a copy of the book for $930.35 plus $3.99 shipping. I couldn't believe it. But what's even more amazing is that book is no longer there, which must mean, could it mean that somebody actually paid that for it? Not worth it. Don't do it. Don't even look for it. It's out of date. From there, from the UCSF, that job fell apart. I tell the story of how it fell apart. It had a lot to do with being a trailing spouse. The only job I got was a job in Washington during the Reagan administration. And I was hired by the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion in Health and Human Services to be the editor of what was eventually the Surgeon General's Report on Nutrition and Health. I was there for 2 years, from 1986 to 88. And one of the things I did there, besides editing that book, was I was a ghostwriter. And I wrote speeches for federal officials and for Surgeon General Koop, who introduced the Surgeon General's report at the press conference that announced it. And he said in advance that he would do that as long as he didn't have to answer any questions about nutrition, because he didn't know anything about nutrition, he said. And I wrote the speech for him. It was an out-of-body experience listening to him give that speech, because he sounded just like me, except he was he's reading my words. And my only regret was that I hadn't made the speech tougher. If I'd known he was going to read it word for word, I'd have made it a much tougher speech. You can watch it. It's on YouTube. From Washington, I got this amazing job at NYU. I've been at New York University since 1988. My fancy title is the Paulette Goddard Professor of Nutrition and Food Studies. Paulette Goddard was the famous movie star who was married to Charlie Chaplin, or not married to Charlie Chaplin at some point. But she left a lot of money to NYU, and I got the professorship. I kind of liked that. And I went to NYU to chair Department of Home Economics. I didn't know home economics programs still existed in 1988, but I was chair of that department, which went through many, many other names from 1988 to 2003. Then I became a professor again, and I retired from NYU in 2017. And when people ask me, how did I end up doing what I did, and how did I write all those books and all of that? My answer to that is a one-word answer. I went there with tenure. It was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to me. It was job security. It meant I couldn't be fired unless I did something really awful. And it really gave me a platform and a degree of stability that I'd never had in my professional life, and allowed me to do a lot of stuff. And the turning point occurred quite soon after I got to NYU, when I went to a meeting in Washington at the National Cancer Institute on behavioral causes of cancer. And there were two behavioral causes that were being discussed at that meeting: diet and cigarette smoking. And I knew that cigarettes caused cancer. I really did. But I had never heard this international group of anti-smoking advocates, physicians and scientists, who one after another talked about how the cigarette industry was marketing its products. And in particular, there was one talk by John Pierce and his colleagues at the University of California, San Diego, who talked about how tobacco advertising was aimed at young people. This was the era of Joe Camel. And again, I knew that cigarette companies were marketing to children, but I had never paid any attention to it. I had never really looked at how cigarette companies were doing that. And these speakers showed slide after slide after slide of Joe Camel everywhere where kids were. And at the end of the meeting, I walked out thinking, we nutritionists should be doing this for Coca-Cola. And I started paying attention. I started paying attention to the way food companies were marketing to adults and marketing to children. I started writing articles about them of one kind or another in professional journals. And I did that for several years. And after I had accumulated a bunch of those articles, I put them together into the book that became Food Politics, thinking at the time that what I was doing was describing the obvious. It never occurred to me that not everybody thought it was that obvious, although I don't know why it wouldn't have, since the cigarette smoking hadn't been that odd, the cigarette marketing hadn't been that obvious to me. And I started writing, in a pretty serious way. I was no longer department chair after 2003, so I had a lot of time to write. And these are the books that I've done since 2002, a hefty bunch of them, one after another. And I explain in the memoir how those came about. One of the books, What to Eat, was translated into Hebrew. This was an article from Haaretz in 2007. And what I loved about it was it came with this enormously unflattering, but very amusing cartoon. So I kind of like that. At NYU, I continue to teach courses about food policy and politics, the food movement, the Farm Bill, food systems, ethics, and advocacy. I'm not teaching full classes anymore, but I'm still giving plenty of lectures. One of the nice things about NYU is that it prides itself, if institutions can do such things, as being a private university in the public service. And the kinds of things that I like doing went under the category of public service. So the public lectures, the media interviews that I do almost every day, writing op-eds and editorials and commentaries. For years, I've been writing a blog, a daily blog at foodpolitics.com, 5 times a week. And then I'm on Twitter or X or whatever you call it still. Though I find those things useful and interesting to do. The interviews with reporters, I talk to reporters or I'm interviewed almost every day. Sometimes I get quoted, sometimes I don't. This is one that was in The Guardian in February. The most recent one was something in the New York Times about xylitol, I think. But whatever it is, I do quite a lot of them. I like talking to reporters. They're smart, they know a lot, and I like helping to shape their stories. The blog I've been doing for 15 years. I post 5 times a week. If you want to, you can go to foodpolitics.com, type your email address in, and you get it delivered to your email once a day. That's kind of fun. I like doing it. It's fun. Doesn't take too much time. I'm currently involved in 2 projects. Project number 1 is a new edition of What to Eat, my book that came out in 2006. It's being retitled What to Eat Now, and it will be published by Picador Press in September 2025, which somehow seems a very long way off, but I'm working on that one pretty much every day. And then I have a new project that I dreamed up with a colleague, and this will be a book on food policy and culture in the United States using cereal boxes to kick off the discussion and to illustrate the issues. I've been collecting cereal boxes since General Mills did a box of total cereal on the Surgeon General's report in 1989. And I collected, I probably have a couple of hundred cereal boxes by now. If you see any interesting ones, send them to me. So that's the story. My mantra, if I have one, is vote with your fork. Very important to vote, but even better, vote with your vote, meaning get involved in food politics, because if we're ever going to change the food system and make it better, everybody's going to have to get involved. And that's where I'll stop. And I thank you very much. And I'll end with these pictures because I always like to show this and say, see, I haven't changed a bit. Thank you so much for letting me share this with you. And I'm hoping to get to talk to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Marion. If you want to stop sharing, I think you and I now can actually just have a beautiful conversation. That was amazing. Thank you. I mean, having read the book, that was a tour de force. I wanted to say apologies. For some reason, the chat, someone mentioned it is not working. So please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A. And I see them popping up, which is great. And I'll make sure we ask them. If you're feeling like you want to ask something aloud, we could probably go ahead and unmute you. And so you can put your hand up. But I'm going to get the privilege of maybe asking a first couple of questions. First of all, I can't remember who was it that called you a badass, but you are a badass.
I had to look it up. I thought it was an insult.
But I think I would also add to that. I mean, your trajectory, and I think your presentation really did a great job of looking at all the different chapters of your life. But the sort of through line to some extent is you've sort of been a little bit of a whistleblower, in the sense that you've sort of been inside of a lot of systems, whether they were academic, it was departments that put you and propped you up in positions where it felt like you had power, but you really maybe didn't, or ways of influencing the conversation. But you managed to somehow continue to buck those authorities, and you kind of stuck to your guns, for lack of a better term. I'm just curious, at may I say your age?
Sure.
Are you 80 years old?
I'm 87, actually.
You're kidding me. Even more of a rock star. No. I'm just sort of wondering, what has it been like for you to be that kind of badass insurgent in some of these positions? And maybe you could tell us a story from the book in which you really had to push through. And a lot of the times I will say they were men in authority. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I never thought of that. thought I needed to do what I had to do. And I think the place where I had to confront it most painfully was when I was working at the medical school in San Francisco. When I didn't have an MD, I wasn't doing research. I had a job as an associate dean, which sounds really important, but I didn't have a portfolio. I was there because I was somebody's wife who they wanted to hire. And, the amazing part about that job was not that it fell apart. And well, when it fell apart, it really fell apart. Um, but that I kept it as long as I did was somewhat miraculous. And I think the thing that really taught me how difficult that situation was when they were hiring a new dean. And there was a absolutely exceptional woman candidate who had been proposed as a candidate for the position. And everybody said, well, we can't hire her. Her husband's a cardiologist and we don't need any more cardiologists. I mean, so here she was being completely excluded. Nobody was asking her or her husband what they thought about what they would both do if she had this job. That was not even an option to think about.
Hmm.
So that was one of them, and I tried to push that as hard as I could, and was essentially told, "You of all people should know. Why are you complaining about that? You of all people should know why." That's an issue. And I think that was the first time that I was confronted with this in anything quite so baldly. And then everything that happened at that medical school was so difficult. There was a dinner for graduating residents, and the chair of it was a very alcohol infused evening. And the chair of the Department of Medicine, who was the most distinguished physician at the school, the most powerful clinical faculty person at the school, told a sexist joke at the expense of a first-year woman resident that was, people are still talking about it. This is 40 years later. I still run into people who remember that dinner because they were so appalled by that. And it was my job to go and talk to him the next week and tell him that he couldn't do that. And that didn't make me very popular. I don't quite know how else to put it. So no wonder everything fell apart quickly when it fell apart. But I felt like there were things I had to do. There were things I probably should have done that were even more. I didn't really understand a lot about how the system worked until it was over, and nobody explained it to me. So I mean, that was partly later, and I described this in the book later, and quite recently, just before the pandemic, I met a woman who has a Nobel Prize in science, and we were off on a trip together, and without in any way minimizing the difficulties of her own life, she came from an academic background. They knew a lot of academics. She traveled to Europe when she was a teenager. She knew about internships and working in other people's laboratories. They had money so that when she had a baby, they had full-time care in the home. She could go right back to work. I mean, her description of what her life was like and how she did what she did made it clear to me that that the economics of this were really profoundly different. And it was very interesting in writing the memoir to look back on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will say this because questions are coming in, but there is something about you were at times called insubordinate, right, for your speaking out. And
Mm.
and I actually, there's a little bit of the sort of, in your 80s to write a memoir looking back at literally the politics behind the food politics, the ingredients of so much of what you were doing, for lack of a better term, really involved your navigating so much of these sort of the influence that was around you. And I think that, this is one of the things I really enjoyed about the book, and why I thought it was so much more than just a history of your food politics. It was your navigating the politics of writing about food politics. And I commend you for that. The last thing I have other questions, but I see people have other ones as well. I wanted to ask a little bit about the sort of, not only there was that moment of the Surgeon Generals where the fat versus sugar arguments, and you were really busy writing this incredible report, and sort of looking back on your work in the public sphere and kind of with government and writing about food. And now we're all reading the books of Michael Pollan, and my daughter took the class in which at Berkeley, in which you and Michael Pollan and Alice Waters, and it's become quite the hot topic to talk about food systems. I mean, you were a pioneer in this region. So maybe if you could talk about the arc of your public writing and the public intellectual part of your work, and how it's changed over the years. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and where you've caught Cirrus, for lack of a term, and where you've really been a pathbreaker in opening up this conversation.
Well, it's interesting. I was asked at one point I published 6 books with University of California Press. And at one point they asked me to write a book that would show exactly the question you've asked, which is the arc and the trajectory of my thinking about nutrition and my way of dealing with it. But when I went back to show them what I had over a 30 or 40-year period, in fact, the articles that I wrote 40 years ago, I could be writing right now. I'm saying the same things over and over and over again, in different contexts and in different ways. But in fact, the basic principles have remained the same. The details changed to some extent. So there went that idea. And it went out the window. I mean, and that was what I showed here, was that I started out thinking about food from the standpoint of politics, because it seemed so obvious to me that you couldn't write about this. Frances Moore Lappé had written Diet for a Small Planet. Her book was era changing. It was the first time anybody had thought about the idea that eating meat is not something that everybody needs to do, and if we didn't, we would have a very different kind of world. So I don't know. I'm not sure there was one. And I was already doing television in 1980. And already answering questions about food politics and food and nutrition and those kinds of things on television then. I don't have any photographs of it, but in the 3rd year, Mary Martin, the actress who was in, what was the famous musical she was in? I've lost it. She was the host for that, but there are no photographs of that remaining that anybody can find. So I was already doing media. I was already talking to reporters, and then that really started in earnest in the early 1990s, when the Department of Agriculture withdrew the Eating Right pyramid under pressure from the meat industry. And I got caught up in a deep throat situation where I had somebody at the Department of Agriculture who was feeding me information that she had asked me to get to the press. And at that point, I was dealing with reporters constantly, and got to know a lot of reporters. I'm still talking to reporters a lot.
So I'm going to go ahead and get to some of the questions, because there's so much to ask about how the industries that you've been dealing with have responded to your writing. And at one point, I think in your book, you do use the term rapacious capitalism. There are obviously that everyone needs to take an active interest in how food is produced. And I can't think of the number of films on Netflix right now that address these issues and have changed.
I'm in 3 of them.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and call out and thank you, Mark Levy, for the first question. Mark asked, "Hola, Doctora Nestle. How great to contact you after these years, after our renegade nutrition action of UCSF School of Medicine in 1981. the info and activism that you and I shared added to and carried to my Latina community for all these years. And thank you. So impactful for my OBGYN patients. Mil gracias, Marion. May you live long and prosper. Should I do the Spock for that one? Please receive a big hug through Zoom. I feel like I should have unmuted you because that is such a beautiful thing. And this is from, I see Kathy Preciado. Oh, it's not Mark Levy. It's Kathy Preciado Partida, who is a doctor. Can I ask, let me see if I can go ahead in the chat and let me go ahead into my, if you're comfortable, I believe I can go in and allow you to talk. Did you want to say something? You're unmuted now. Dr. Preciado Partida, can you speak?
She could, except that she actually isn't here. I'm her husband. I'm Mark. And she just wanted to say thank you for your mentorship years ago. And she really appreciated what you were able to bring to her medical education, and she was able to bring forward to all of her patients. So thank you from Kathy.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really touched by that. I hardly ever hear from people at UCSF, so it's really wonderful.
I love that. That's amazing. I love somehow these little reunions can happen so far and virtually. So I do know Janet, and I know Janet is here. Janet's asked a question. I've heard that there's a new Rice Krispies box showing a pregnant woman. It's a generation. It's generated some dynamic discussion relative to reproductive rights in this current day. Have you seen it, and any thoughts?
I ordered one. You can only buy them online. And I've ordered one. They say it'll ship in 4 to 6 weeks. It's Kellogg's K. It's supposed to be their nutrition cereal, and it says on the front of it that, you know, it's got vitamins in it. The person who's pictured is a woman named Molly Baz, who, of course, I had never heard of. She's a cookbook writer, and I guess an influencer of some kind. And that box is going to go right in our book.
I'm curious why.
In the women's chapter.
Yeah, well, what does it say to you right now? If you can share some of your thinking, why, or maybe even Janet can add, what is it about pregnancy that is so revealed in a Rice, in the K cover? What is it that is so evocative?
Well, it shows her baby bump. I mean, her bare baby bump. It's, it's an astonishing photograph, and very much like the one that Deborah Winger did on some magazine years ago. And Kellogg is trying, this is about selling cereal. I would like to know from Janet, please, what's the talk about that? Oh,
I'm going to go ahead and see if I can unmute Janet. And Janet, give me just a moment while I get through the levers of, here we go. And if you're comfortable, and I'm sure she will be because I know her. Janet, you're on. Can you tell us a little bit about what brought up your question?
Oh, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go for it, Janet.
Hi. Hello, I'm so happy to see you. Been reading you for many years. I've worked in health and nutrition policy and food systems work myself. I happened to see this discussion on Nextdoor. I don't know how common Nextdoor is. When I lived in New York, it was years ago. So is it there?
Yeah, but that's not what they're talking about.
Well, for some reason, there was a very active discussion, and I think it's because of what is occurring in terms of reproductive rights and Roe v. Wade and all that stuff. And it was interesting to me that the person who brought it up was seeing lots of connections that she didn't think was coincidental, but other people were seeing no connections whatsoever to this image, which was quite a surprise to me also. And it reminded me of all the years I've worked in public health and whatnot, that many people do not recognize, you think they would, as you mentioned by now, relationship between imagery, marketing, ownership of food systems, and influencers of policy. And so it was interesting to me that only one person saw a potential connection between this imagery, and maybe others thought There was nothing there, it was just coincidence. Do you
Hmm.
see a connection?
It wasn't, I'm totally involved in cereal boxes. You have to understand that.
Right.
But and I have a co-author who told me about this, or actually I was told, yeah, my co-author sent me this, and we've both sent our $5 into Kellogg to get it. You have to go on the Kellogg website to buy it. It's not going to appear in Walmart. As far as I can tell. I mean, I didn't know what to think about it, but I'm certainly going to be looking at what everybody is saying about it. It's an astonishing photograph, as the Deborah Winger was in its day. I think she was in Vogue or something like that, where she was naked and pregnant on the cover. But this is about selling cereal. That's what it's about. And it's an astonishing way to do that.
It's
Yeah.
very interesting. I took a food course a number of years ago from someone who had studied at Bastyr out here, and he was down on cereal as being one of the most processed foods that you can possibly imagine. Things cooked to sizes and shapes that are just don't exist within wheat nature, you know. So is this the sort of trajectory of the writing on cereal that you're going for? Is it about, because that's a health kick, right? Kellogg's and Special K are looking at themselves as healthy foods, but curious to know what your current thinking is about cereal.
Well, this is going to be a history of food and nutrition policy in the United States there's no element on a box of cereal that doesn't have a story about it. And because cereal boxes are changed so frequently by the manufacturer, sometimes as many as 12 times a year, they can respond to trends, they can respond to cultural shifts, they can respond to almost anything that's going on in society. And so we want to use the cereal boxes to illustrate what those shifts and changes and policy changes were. And sometimes the cultural shifts. I mean, Kellogg's has a gay pride cereal that they put out a couple of years ago. And I'm particularly interested in health claims. So there used to be one with a big immunity banner. What's the story on Cheerios gluten-free? There's a whole story about Cheerios gluten-free. There's a story about every single element. And some of the stories are just jaw-dropping, because all of this is about marketing. And the junky cereals didn't get really junky until the 1960s. They had to wait until the first Kellogg died, because he was opposed to sugar. He was way ahead of his time on sugar. And when he died, that's when the sugary cereals came in. So yes, the junky ones that are marketed to kids. So one big question that the book will address is, when did it become okay for kids to eat that kind of stuff for breakfast?
Well, I
Still,
think it relates to Jessica's question, which is, what is the worst, most dangerous food trend popular now? And maybe cereal is a long history, but is there anything that you're seeing currently that worries you?
oh yeah, the pushback on ultra-processed foods. The concept of ultra-processed foods is a new one. Relatively, it was developed by a professor of public health in Brazil, and therefore it's not American. So we don't have to pay attention to it. But it defines a specific category of junk foods that is heavily processed and contains lots and lots and lots of food additives. And there is now a quite extraordinary amount of evidence that people who eat a lot of what are now called ultra-processed foods have a higher risk for obesity and all of the diseases for which obesity is a risk factor. Those are all there, and there are 1,500 or more studies that have come out in the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, it's really a lot of evidence. And then there's one very, very well-controlled clinical trial that shows that these foods get people to eat more.
Mm.
People can't stop eating them. So the food industry is involved in an enormous pushback on that. And
Well,
they've been,
you quote your colleague Michael Pollan in "Eat Food Not Much, Mostly Plants" in
oh
your
yeah,
in your book.
yeah.
Can you answer Dawn's question, which is your view of the USDA these days and its trajectory regarding food and nutrition policy?
Well, the USDA, how it's doing depends a lot on who the staff is. And right now, the USDA has a particularly excellent staff. So that the people who have been appointed by the Biden administration, I think are really they're doing the best they can under very difficult circumstances. The USDA participates with Health and Human Services in the dietary guidelines. That process is ongoing and is kind of weird, but it always is. And they're in charge of SNAP and food assistance programs, and they're trying as hard as they can to keep those programs going and viable. I give them a lot of credit for that. They were overturned by Congress. You know, they have to do what Congress says. And the real problem lies with Congress, not the USDA, although there were parts of the USDA that still, you know, it's a schizophrenic agency with sub-agencies that are working at completely cross purposes for historical reasons.
So I'm wondering if maybe you can share just a couple of the really wonderful stories from the book. And one of them is about a dinner that you had with Julia Child. And I'm hoping it brought a smile to your face. It's a wonderful story. And I'm wondering if you might share that story with us. And if there's any other story from the book that you just really loved discovering in the writing of your memoir.
Well, the Julia Child story was an obvious one. You know, I met Julia Child early on in my time at NYU because I was introduced to her by somebody who knew her very well from Cambridge, who said that if I met Julia, maybe Julia would change her mind about nutritionists. Julia Child was famous for saying that nutritionists had ruined food for the world, that the emphasis on reducing fat had taken the flavor out of food, and she had not one good word to say about nutritionists. So I tell the story about this dinner, which was supposed to be at the home of Nancy Jenkins, who's a well-known food writer who lives in Cambridge, and the date had been set months in advance, and I heard nothing about it up until the week before, when I finally called Nancy and said, is the dinner still on? And she said, oh, didn't anybody tell you I broke my foot? I live upstairs. I can't come downstairs. I can't cook. This terrible thing has happened. And all I could think of was, oh no, my dinner with Juliet's gone. And then, you know, I commiserated as long as I could stand it, and then said, I guess the dinner's over. Oh, no, she said, didn't anybody tell you? Julia's going to host it at her home. So I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. So I go to her home, and I'm with other people. There were several other people who were going to be there. And we walk in, and Julia is standing there, stony-faced in her kitchen, the very kitchen that's in the Smithsonian even now, stony-faced. And I sit down, and she says, and I can't do Julia. And now Marion will introduce herself. I thought, uh-oh. And it went downhill from there. She was cold. She was hostile. Somebody had brought a salad. That was the first course. And then she produced the largest slab of beef I had ever been offered, set it down in front of me, and said, there's nothing like a good piece of beef now, is there? I thought, oh, what do I do now? I ate it. But I didn't enjoy it very much. And it went on from there, and it never got any better. And I had brought my copy of Mastering the Art of French Cooking with me because I wanted her to sign it. And anybody looking at this book could tell that it was really heavily used. I had gone through a period of competitive home cooking with friends. We all cooked from Mastering the Art of French Cooking. There were pages stuck together. There were brown spots all over it. Nothing. She signed it quite coldly. And it was a really difficult evening. And then when we started food studies at NYU, she softened a little bit and, sent us stuff for the department. And after a while, we became quite good friends. But it took a while. And I have my collection of treasured notes from Julia, just like everybody else does. And of course, I admired her extravagantly. I had watched her programs and learned to cook from some of them. But yeah, so anyway, that story's in the book. It was a barrier I hadn't expected. I don't know. I mean, I've told some of the others, it's hard to know. I mean, the going to NYU, I guess, is another one where I went there to chair a department of home economics. That was a venerable program. It had been there a long time. And it had been, in my view, very seriously neglected for a very long time. And I tell the story about when I first came to NYU. All the faculty were off at a dietetics meeting. And so I was going around and doing get acquainted visits with people at NYU. And every place I went, people said the same thing. Oh, it's so good you're here. We really need you. I hate to bring this up when you've only just gotten here, but there's something I really have to bring to your attention. Well, what was that? Your kitchen's dirty. And when I heard this for the third time, and I heard it constantly, I thought I better go take a look. The kitchen was in another building. This is a teaching kitchen for the department. And I went to look at it. I could smell it getting off the elevator. And it was a 1950s green, avocado green home economics kitchen in great disarray with quite visible signs of wildlife everywhere. And it was pretty shocking. And I went back to the department and asked the secretaries, who's in charge of the kitchen? And they told me that Debbie was. I asked who Debbie was. Debbie was a graduate student, poor thing. I said, would you please send Debbie to talk to me, please? Debbie walked into my office and burst into tears. And I had to assure her that this was not her responsibility. And then we talked about what we could do to get started on trying to get this place cleaned. And she said there was a lot of broken equipment. And I said, well, why don't you try to see if you get the equipment fixed? So she comes in a week later and she could just, her hands were over her mouth. She was laughing so hard she couldn't stop it. She said, you're just not going to believe this. I said, try me. She said, you know those two convection ovens in the corner that haven't worked? She said, well, the repair person came and pulled them away from the wall. They'd never been plugged in. The wires were still packed into the machine. They'd never been unpacked. And they had been there for 10 years and never worked.
Wow.
And that was what I was up against. And I kept thinking, I have a doctorate in molecular biology. And what I have to deal with is getting a kitchen clean. How did this happen?
Amazing stories. The whole book is filled with them. I think, from your roots with parents who believed in, I guess they were communists, and you grew up in a home that believed that you had to fight disequity and speak up. I think that's really a through line in how you've really spoken up for so many years and continue to. I think we all look forward to your book about cereal that holds such a special place in all of our hearts that it just touches so many people, and there it is right before you and you don't even know that it's there. Food politics is something that you've been such an incredible champion of. You've brought that to all of us and you are such a pioneer. We are so grateful for your memoir, for the time that you've joined with us today. I want to thank everyone for being here, especially Marion, who she and I finally got to have our conversation. So I'm going to stop the recording in just a moment and say thank you all for coming. Have a beautiful Sunday. Please look for our upcoming season. We have Chef Moshe Bassan coming on November 2nd. His event was canceled last year after October 7th. I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about the politics of food in Israel right now. And then we have chefs from Mexico, as well as Sephardic chefs coming next year. We have a new season that will be announced on September 1st. This is our last program of our season. Look for more information at sjcc.org. census.org/arts. Thank you so much, Dr. Nestle, for joining us today. It's been such an incredible conversation to have with you.